The 50-cent coin felt cold against Margaret Thompson's palm as she stared at the auction block where a man stood silent and still as carved stone. His massive frame towered over the auctioneer, easily 6 feet 8 inches of solid muscle wrapped in worn denim and a faded flannel shirt. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What drew every eye in the crowded barn wasn't his impressive height or the way he seemed to dwarf everyone around him. It was the black cloth mask that covered the entire upper half of his face, leaving only his strong jaw and compressed lips visible to the world. "What am I bid for this here worker?" the auctioneer called out, his voice echoing through the musty air of Henderson's farm equipment auction in rural Nebraska. Strong as an ox, quiet as a church mouse, and willing to work for room and board. Then told he's got some Apache blood in him, though he ain't one for talking about it or much of anything else for that matter. Margaret shifted uncomfortably on the hard wooden bench, her widow's pension check folded carefully in her coat pocket. $27.50. That was all she had left after paying rent on her small farmhouse and buying groceries for the month. The corn harvest had failed again, leaving her 160-acre farm nothing but dried stalks and broken dreams. At 62 years old, she was facing the very real possibility of losing everything her late husband Robert had worked 30 years to build. The masked man never moved, never acknowledged the curious stares or whispered comments from the crowd. His stillness was so complete that Margaret found herself wondering if he was even breathing. There was something about his posture that spoke of dignity maintained despite circumstances that had clearly stripped away most of his choices. She recognized that particular kind of quiet desperation because she'd been carrying it herself for the past 8 months since Robert's funeral. "Do I hear $1?" The auctioneer continued, scanning the sparse crowd with growing impatience. "This man's got papers saying he's cleared for farm work, no criminal record, just down on his luck. Like plenty of folks these days. Surely someone's got use for strong hands and a willingness to work hard." The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Margaret could see farmers and ranchers in the audience shifting in their seats, some looking interested but hesitant, others clearly put off by the man's unusual appearance. The mask made everyone nervous, she realized. People didn't trust what they couldn't see, and in a small farming community where everyone knew everyone else's business, a mysterious stranger was automatically suspect. 50 cents, Margaret heard herself say, her voice carrying clearly through the barn before she'd fully realized she was speaking. "I bid 50 cents. The auctioneer looked surprised, then somewhat relieved that someone had finally broken the uncomfortable silence. "I have 50 cents from the lady in the blue coat." "Do I hear 75 cents? Anyone willing to go 75? Margaret's heart pounded as she waited for someone else to bid. 50 cents was literally all she could afford to risk, and even that felt like throwing money away when she needed every penny for basic survival. But something about the man's stillness, the way he held himself with such quiet dignity despite being auctioned off like farm equipment, had touched something deep in her chest that she hadn't felt since Robert died. The barn remained silent except for the shuffling of feet and clearing of throats. Margaret could feel curious eyes turning toward her, neighbors and acquaintances wondering what on earth Margaret Thompson thought she was doing bidding on a strange man when everyone knew she could barely keep her own farm running. 50 cents. "Going once," the auctioneer called out, his gavel hovering over the wooden block. "Going twice. Anyone else want to speak up for this fellow?" Margaret found herself holding her breath, suddenly terrified that someone would outbid her and equally terrified that no one would. What was she thinking? She couldn't afford to feed another person, couldn't pay wages, couldn't even offer decent accommodations. Her farmhouse was small and run down, her barn needed major repairs, and her fields were producing nothing but weeds and disappointment. Sold to Margaret Thompson for 50 cents. The gavel cracked against wood with a sound that seemed to echo forever in the sudden quiet. Margaret sat frozen for a moment, unable to believe what she'd just done. Around her, people began gathering their things and heading for the exit, the brief excitement of the auction giving way to evening chores and family obligations. She watched the masked man step down from the auction block with surprising grace. For someone so large, his movements controlled and purposeful despite the circumstances. The auctioneer's assistant, a thin man named Pete Morrison, whom Margaret recognized from church, approached her with a clipboard and a slightly bewildered expression. "Well, Margaret, I gotta say that's the most unusual purchase I've seen at one of these auctions. You sure you know what you're getting yourself into?" Margaret stood on unsteady legs, fishing the 50-cent piece from her coat pocket. "I'm not sure about anything these days, Pete, but I reckon we'll figure it out as we go." She handed over the coin and signed the necessary paperwork with trembling fingers. The transaction felt surreal, like something from a dream or a story she might have read in one of the romance novels she borrowed from the library. Normal people didn't buy human beings at auctions, even if it was technically just paying for work contracts and transportation costs. "His name's listed here as Thomas Crow Feather," Pete said, pointing to the paperwork. "Says he's 34. Years old, no known relatives, been working odd jobs since he got out of the Veterans Hospital about 6 months ago. The mask thing started after some kind of accident overseas, according to what Henderson told me. Won't talk about it, won't take it off, but he's supposed to be a good worker when he can find employment." Margaret nodded, trying to process this information while watching Thomas Crow Feather gather his few possessions from beside the auction block. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He had a single duffel bag that looked military issue and a battered cowboy hat that he settled carefully over his masked head. Everything about him suggested someone who had learned to travel light and expect nothing permanent. "You want me to introduce you to?" Pete asked, glancing between Margaret and the man she'd just purchased the services of. "Might be a bit awkward otherwise." "That would be helpful," Margaret admitted, suddenly aware that she had no idea how to approach someone in Thomas's situation. "What did you say to a person you just bought at auction? How did you start a conversation with someone who apparently didn't speak?" Pete led her over to where Thomas stood waiting patiently beside his bag. Up close, he was even more imposing than he'd appeared from across the barn. His shoulders were broad enough that Margaret had to tilt her head back to look at where his eyes would be behind the black mask. His hands, she noticed, were scarred but clean, with the kind of calluses that came from honest work. "Thomas, this is Margaret Thompson. She's the lady who bid on your work contract. Margaret, meet Thomas Crow Feather." Thomas turned to Ward Margaret and nodded once, a brief acknowledgement that somehow conveyed both respect and wariness. He didn't speak, didn't extend his hand for shaking, just waited with that same patient stillness he'd shown on the auction block. "Hello, Thomas," Margaret said, her voice coming out smaller than she'd intended. "I live about 10 miles north of here, run a small corn farm that's been in my family for 30 years. I can't pay much in wages, but I can offer room and board. And honest work if you're interested." Another nod, this one accompanied by what might have been relief in the set of his shoulders. Thomas picked up his duffel bag and looked toward the barn exit, clearly ready to leave whenever she was. The drive to Margaret's farm passed in complete silence. Thomas sat in the passenger seat of her old Ford pickup, his massive frame making the cab feel impossibly small. He looked straight ahead through the windshield, hands folded in his lap, giving no indication of what he thought about the flat Nebraska landscape rolling past outside. Margaret found herself stealing glances at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention. The mask covered everything from his cheekbones up, secured with what looked like leather ties that disappeared under his dark hair. She could see enough of his profile to know that he had strong features and darker skin that suggested his Apache heritage, but the mask made it impossible to read his expressions or guess his thoughts. "The farm's not much to look at right now," she said as they turned into her gravel driveway. "Had a real bad year with the corn, and I haven't been able to keep up with all the maintenance since my husband passed. But the house is solid and there's a good well for water." Thomas looked around at the property as they approached the small white farmhouse that had been Margaret's home for 3 decades. She tried to see it through his eyes and winced at what she observed. The paint was peeling on the shutters, several. Fence posts were leaning at dangerous angles, and the barn door hung crooked on rusted hinges. The fields beyond the house were stubbled with broken corn stalks that told the story of too little rain and too many problems. "I know it's not much," Margaret continued, parking beside the front porch steps. "But it's home, and there's always been enough room for folks who need a place to land for a while." She led him up the porch steps, noting how he automatically ducked his head to avoid the hanging flower baskets that Robert had installed for her birthday 5 years ago. The baskets were empty now, just twisted wire and dead stems that she hadn't had the heart to take down. The inside of the house was clean but sparse, furnished with the kind of solid, practical pieces that farm families accumulated over decades of making do. The living room held a couch that had been reupholstered twice, a coffee table made from an old door, and family photographs that chronicled 30 years of marriage and farming. Margaret watched Thomas take in the details with what seemed like careful attention, though it was impossible to tell what he thought about any of it. "The spare room is upstairs," Margaret said, leading him toward the narrow staircase. "It's not fancy, but there's a good bed and a dresser, and the window looks out over the back fields. Bathroom's at the end of the hall, and you're welcome to use the kitchen whenever you need to." The spare room had been Robert's office before his illness, filled with farm records and tax documents and agricultural magazines. Margaret had cleared most of it out after the funeral, leaving behind only the furniture and a sense of emptiness that seemed to echo through the entire house. She'd hoped that having someone else in the house might help fill some of that silence, though she hadn't expected that someone to be a mysterious masked man she'd bought at an equipment auction. Thomas set his duffel bag on the bed and looked around the room with the same careful attention he'd given the rest of the house. He moved to the window and stood looking out at the fields where corn should have been growing tall and green, instead of lying broken and brown under the autumn sky. "I usually get up around 5 to start morning chores," Margaret said, lingering in the doorway. "There's coffee in the kitchen by 5:30, and breakfast whenever you're ready for it. The barn needs a lot of work, and there's fencing that needs repair, and the equipment shed has a roof that's been leaking since the spring storms. I can't pay much, maybe $50 a week plus room and board, but the work is steady if you're willing." Thomas turned from the window to face her and nodded his acceptance. Then he did something that surprised her. He pulled a small notebook from his shirt pocket, wrote something quickly, and handed her the page. "Thank you for giving me a chance," the note said in careful, precise handwriting. "I will work hard and cause no trouble. Is there anything you need me to start on tomorrow?" Margaret felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. The note was the first real communication they'd had, and it suggested that Thomas was not just capable of thoughtful interaction, but grateful for the opportunity she'd provided. She took a pencil from her own pocket and wrote a response on the back of his note. "Start with whatever looks most urgent to you. You probably see things I've gotten used to ignoring. And Thomas, you don't have to thank me. We both needed something today, and maybe we can help each other figure out what that is." He read her response and nodded again, this time with what might have been the hint of a smile around his visible mouth. It was the first crack in his stoic facade that Margaret had seen, and it gave her hope that this unusual arrangement might actually work out for both of them. That evening, Margaret cooked a simple dinner of pot roast and vegetables, making extra portions without really thinking about why. She'd been cooking for one person for 8 months, measuring ingredients carefully to avoid waste, eating leftovers until they were gone or spoiled. Having someone else to feed felt strange but welcome, like a return to purpose she hadn't realized. She'd lost. Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway at exactly 6 o'clock, as if he'd been waiting for some kind of signal. He'd cleaned up from the day's travel, his hair damp from washing and his clothes neat despite their obvious age. The mask remained firmly in place, and Margaret found herself wondering what kind of injury could be severe enough to require such complete concealment. "I hope you're hungry," she said, gesturing toward the table she'd set for two. "It's been a while since I've cooked for more than just myself, so there might be too much of everything." Thomas took the seat across from her and waited until she'd served herself before reaching for the serving dishes. His manners were excellent, she noticed, the kind of careful courtesy that spoke of good upbringing despite his current circumstances. He ate steadily and with obvious appreciation, pausing occasionally to write brief notes of thanks or requests to pass dishes. "You don't have to write everything down," Margaret said gently as she watched him compose another note. "I mean, if you prefer not to speak, that's perfectly fine. But if it's just that you're not comfortable talking yet, I want you to know that there's no pressure either way." Thomas considered this for a moment, then set down his pencil and looked directly at her. When he spoke, his voice was deep and slightly rough, as if it wasn't used very often. "I haven't talked much to anyone in a long time," he said carefully. "Sometimes it's easier to write things down, make sure I'm saying what I mean to say." Margaret felt a little thrill of victory at getting him to speak, followed immediately by sadness at the implication that he'd been isolated for so long that basic conversation had become difficult. "Well, whenever you feel like talking, I'm a good listener. And when you don't feel like talking, I'm comfortable with quiet too." They finished dinner in companionable silence, Thomas helping to clear dishes and wash up without being asked. Margaret found his presence soothing in a way she hadn't expected. He moved through her kitchen with careful respect, treating her space and belongings as if they mattered, which was more consideration than she'd received from most of the neighbors who'd offered help after Robert's death. That night, Margaret lay in bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person in her house. Footsteps in the upstairs hallway, water running in the bathroom, the creak of floorboards as Thomas moved around his room. For the first time in 8 months, the house didn't feel empty, and Margaret drifted off to sleep with something that might have been hope warming her chest. She woke before dawn to the sound of someone moving around in the kitchen. Alarmed, she pulled on her robe and crept downstairs, unsure what she might find. Thomas was standing at the stove, fully dressed and cooking what smelled like eggs and bacon. Coffee was already brewing, and the kitchen table was set for two. "I hope you don't mind," he said when he noticed her in the doorway. His voice was still rough with morning, but seemed to come more easily than it had the night before. "I'm used to getting up early, and I thought you might appreciate having breakfast ready when you came down." Margaret stared at him in amazement. It had been years since anyone had cooked breakfast for her, decades since she'd woken up to find food prepared and coffee brewing without her effort. The simple kindness of it made her throat tight with unexpected emotion. "Mind, Thomas, this is wonderful. I can't remember the last time someone made breakfast for me." He served her eggs cooked exactly the way she liked them, though she was certain she'd never told him her preferences. The bacon was crisp but not burnt, the coffee strong but not bitter. Everything was perfect, as if he'd been paying careful attention to details she hadn't even noticed sharing. "How did you know how I like my eggs?" she asked, genuinely curious. Thomas looked slightly embarrassed. "I watched how you cooked them yesterday morning before you left for the auction. Figured if that was how you made them for yourself, that was probably how you preferred them." The observation was so thoughtful, so indicative of someone who paid attention to small details that mattered to other people, that Margaret felt her initial wariness about her unusual houseguest dissolving completely. Whatever had happened to Thomas, whatever circumstances had led him to that auction block, he was clearly a person who understood kindness and was capable of returning it. After breakfast, Thomas disappeared outside to assess the work that needed to be done around the farm. Margaret watched through the kitchen window as he walked slowly around the property, examining fence posts and barn doors and equipment with the careful attention of someone who understood what he was looking at. His movements were purposeful and efficient, suggesting experience with farm work despite his mysterious background. He was gone for over an hour, and when he returned, he had a list written in that same careful handwriting she'd seen the night before. The list was comprehensive and practical, prioritizing urgent repairs over cosmetic improvements, estimating time requirements and material costs with what seemed like professional expertise. "This is incredibly thorough," Margaret said, studying his recommendations. "How do you know so much about farm maintenance?" "Grew up on my grandfather's ranch in Arizona," Thomas replied, settling into the kitchen chair across from her. "Learned to fix things early because we couldn't afford to hire help for every problem that came up." It was the first real information he'd shared about his background, and Margaret felt honored that he was beginning to trust her with pieces of his history. She wanted to ask more questions, to understand how he'd gone from a childhood on Arizona ranch to a masked presence at a Nebraska equipment auction. But she sensed that pushing for information would shut down the tentative communication that was developing between them. Instead, she focused on the practical matters outlined in his list. "We can afford to buy materials for the most urgent repairs," she said, calculating costs against her meager savings. "The fence posts and barn door hardware shouldn't cost more than $100, and I can manage that if it means keeping the place from falling down around our ears." Thomas nodded and made a note beside several items on his list. "I can do most of this work myself if you can get the materials. Might take a few weeks to get through everything, but it'll make a real difference in how the place looks and functions." Margaret felt a flutter of something that might have been excitement. For months, she'd been watching her farm deteriorate while feeling helpless to stop the decline. Having someone with the knowledge and willingness to tackle necessary repairs felt like being thrown a lifeline when she'd been drowning in problems she couldn't solve alone. "Thomas," she said impulsively, "can I ask you something personal?" He tensed slightly, his posture becoming more guarded. "You can ask. Why the mask?" "I mean, you don't have to tell me if you don't want to, but I'm curious about what happened." Thomas was quiet for so long that Margaret began to think he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Explosion. In Afghanistan. Shrapnel took out most of the left side of my face. The doctors did what they could, but it's not something most people want to look at over breakfast." Margaret felt her heart break a little for the pain she heard in his admission. "I'm sorry. That must have been terrifying." "The explosion was quick. The recovery took 2 years and more surgeries than I like to remember. When I finally got out of the hospital, I found out that looking like a monster makes it hard to find work or make friends or have any kind of normal life." The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable, and Margaret understood suddenly why he'd ended up at an equipment auction being sold to the highest bidder. Society had made it clear that his sacrifice and service were less important than his appearance, leaving him with few options for supporting himself. "You're not a monster," Margaret said firmly. "You're a person who served his country and got hurt doing it. Anyone who can't see past your injuries to recognize your character isn't worth knowing anyway." Thomas looked at her with what she thought might have been surprise behind the mask. "Most people don't see it that way." "Then most people are idiots," Margaret replied with more heat than she'd intended. "I've been watching you for less than 24 hours, and I can already tell that you're kind, thoughtful, hardworking, and considerate. Those are the things that matter, not what your face looks like." The silence that followed her declaration was heavy with emotion. Thomas sat very still, as if he was trying to process the idea that someone might value his character over his appearance. Margaret wondered how long it had been since anyone had looked at him and seen anything other than the mask and the damage it concealed. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice thick with feeling. "I haven't heard anything like that in a very long time." Margaret reached across the table and touched his hand briefly, a gesture of comfort that she hoped conveyed what words couldn't express. His skin was warm and rough with calluses, unmistakably human despite the mask that made him seem somehow otherworldly. "Well, you'll be hearing it regularly around here," she said with determination. "I don't have much to offer, but I can promise you'll be treated with respect and kindness for as long as you want to stay." Something in Thomas's posture relaxed, as if he'd been holding himself ready to leave at the first sign of rejection or cruelty. The idea that he'd been braced for her to change her mind and send him away made Margaret even more determined to prove that this arrangement could work for both of them. The first week of October brought an unexpected cold snap that caught everyone in Miller County off guard. Margaret woke to frost covering her windows and the sound of Thomas already moving around downstairs, starting what had become their morning routine. In just 10 days, he had transformed not only the physical appearance of her farm, but the entire rhythm of her daily life. She found him in the kitchen as usual, coffee brewing and breakfast preparations underway. The morning light streaming through the newly repaired window caught the strong line of his jaw, and Margaret found herself wondering again what the rest of his face looked like beneath the black mask that never seemed to leave his head, even during meals. Morning frost came early this year, Thomas said without turning from the stove where he was cooking eggs with the precise attention he brought to everything he did. "Might want to think about bringing in the last of the garden vegetables before they freeze." Margaret accepted the cup of coffee he handed her, noting how he always seemed to know exactly how much cream she preferred without asking. These small observations of her habits and preferences had become a source of quiet amazement to her. Robert had lived with her for 30 years and never remembered that she liked her coffee light, yet Thomas had absorbed this detail after watching her prepare it twice. "I'll work on the garden today," she agreed, settling into what had become her usual chair at the kitchen table. "What's on your agenda?" Thomas placed a perfectly prepared plate in front of her and took his own seat across the table. Over the past week, their breakfast conversations had evolved from stilted politeness to genuine communication, though he still seemed to choose his words carefully, as if unused to having someone listen to his thoughts and opinions. "I'd finish replacing those fence posts on the north boundary," he said, cutting his eggs with methodical precision. "Should have them all secured before the ground freezes too hard to work with. After that, maybe start on the barn roof if the weather holds." Margaret had watched him work on those fence posts for 3 days, marveling at his combination of physical strength and careful craftsmanship. He approached every task with the same deliberate attention to detail, whether he was replacing rotted wood or adjusting the hinges on the chicken coop door. The results spoke for themselves. Her farm was beginning to look like a place where people took pride in their surroundings, instead of just struggling to survive. "Thomas," she said, hesitating slightly before voicing the question that had been bothering her for days. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but where did you learn to do all this work? I mean, you said you grew up on your grandfather's ranch, but the way you approach repairs, it's like you've had professional training." Thomas set down his fork and was quiet for a moment, his visible expression thoughtful. Margaret had learned to read the subtle changes in his posture and the set of his mouth since the mask made traditional facial expressions impossible to interpret. "Army Corps of Engineers," he said finally. 8 years of building and rebuilding infrastructure in some of the most challenging conditions you can imagine. Iraq, Afghanistan, places where if you didn't build it right the first time, people died. The revelation explained so much about his methodical approach to every task, his ability to assess structural problems with professional expertise, and his obvious comfort with physical labor that would challenge men half his age. It also added another layer to the tragedy of his current circumstances, suggesting skills and experience that should have made him highly employable in civilian life. 8 years, Margaret repeated, trying to imagine what he must have seen and done during that time. That's a substantial commitment to service. It was supposed to be a career, Thomas said, his voice carrying a note of old disappointment. Had plans to make it to 20 years, maybe become an instructor or work on major construction projects stateside. The explosion changed all that. Margaret wanted to ask more questions, to understand better how someone with his background and skills had ended up at an equipment auction being sold for 50 cents. But she sensed that pushing for too much personal information too quickly might cause him to retreat back into the careful silence he'd maintained when he first arrived. Instead, she focused on expressing appreciation for the work he was doing. "Whatever brought you here, I'm grateful for your expertise. This place was falling apart faster than I could keep up with, and having someone who actually knows what they're doing has made all the difference." Thomas nodded acknowledgement of her thanks, but Margaret caught something in his expression that suggested her gratitude meant more to him than simple professional recognition. She was beginning to understand that his isolation had been about more than just physical disfigurement. It seemed to have included a loss of purpose and identity that went to the core of who he was as a person. After breakfast, Margaret spent the morning in her garden, harvesting the last tomatoes and peppers before the predicted hard freeze could destroy them. The work was peaceful and meditative, giving her time to think about how dramatically her life had changed since that impulsive decision at the auction. She could hear Thomas working on the fence line, the steady rhythm of his hammer creating a soundtrack to her thoughts. There was something deeply satisfying about having productive work happening all around her, about being part of a team effort to improve and maintain her property. For months after Robert's death, the farm had felt like a burden she was carrying alone. Now it felt like a project she was sharing with someone who understood both its challenges and its potential. Around noon, she prepared sandwiches and lemonade and walked out to where Thomas was working. He had removed his flannel shirt in deference to the warming day, revealing a white t-shirt that clung to a physique that spoke of years of demanding physical work. His movements as he lifted and positioned fence posts were fluid and efficient, suggesting strength that was as much about technique as raw power. "Thought you might be ready for a break," Margaret said, setting the food on a tree stump that served as an impromptu table. Thomas straightened and accepted the sandwich with obvious appreciation. "This is perfect timing. I was just thinking about stopping for lunch." They ate in companionable silence, sitting on the tailgate of Margaret's old pickup truck and looking out over the fields that stretched toward the horizon. The view was peaceful in the way that only rural landscapes could be, vast and open, and full of possibilities that city dwellers never experienced. "Tell me about your grandfather's ranch," Margaret said, genuinely curious about the childhood that had taught Thomas to work with such skill and dedication. Thomas was quiet for a moment, as if deciding how much of his history he was willing to share. When he spoke, his voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there when he talked about his military service. 2,000 acres in eastern Arizona, right up against the Gila National Forest. My grandfather, Joseph Crow Feather, started with nothing but a government land grant and 40 head of cattle that he bought with money he saved working on the railroad. Margaret could hear the pride in his voice as he described the ranch his grandfather had built from scratch, creating something lasting and valuable through decades of hard work and careful management. It reminded her of her own family's history with their Nebraska farm, though on a much larger scale. "Sounds like he was quite a man," she observed. "He was everything I wanted to be when I grew up," Thomas said simply. "Taught me that honest work was the most important thing a man could do, that taking care of the land meant it would take care of you, and that your word was the only thing nobody could take away from you, no matter how hard times got." The description painted a picture of the kind of upbringing that produced men like Thomas, people who understood the value of integrity and craftsmanship and service to something larger than themselves. It also made Margaret wonder what had happened to separate him from that foundation and land him in his current circumstances. "Do you still have family there?" she asked carefully. Thomas shook his head, his expression growing distant. "Grandfather died while I was overseas on my second tour. The ranch got sold to pay medical bills and back taxes. By the time I got out of the hospital and made it back to Arizona, it was owned by some corporation that turned it into a hunting preserve for wealthy tourists." The loss in his voice was unmistakable, and Margaret felt her heart ache for yet another tragedy in a life that seemed to have been marked by more than its share of disappointment and grief. Losing the family land while he was serving his country added insult to the injury he'd already suffered, creating a pattern of sacrifice that had been rewarded with abandonment and isolation. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it deeply. "Losing family land is like losing part of your identity." "That's exactly what it felt like," Thomas agreed. "I kept thinking that if I could just get well enough to go home, everything would be like it was before. Took me a long time to accept that the home I remembered didn't exist anymore." Margaret understood that particular kind of loss intimately. Her own sense of identity had been shattered when Robert died, leaving her feeling disconnected from the life and purpose that had defined her for 3 decades. The difference was that she still had the physical place that held their shared memories, while Thomas had lost even that anchor to his past. "Maybe that's why this arrangement is working out for both of us," she said thoughtfully. "We both needed a new definition of home, something we could build together instead of trying to recreate what we'd lost." Thomas looked at her with what seemed like surprise, as if the idea that their partnership might be mutually beneficial hadn't occurred to him. Margaret realized that his experiences had trained him to expect charity or pity rather than genuine collaboration, making it difficult for him to recognize when he was contributing as much as he was receiving. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors in the form of Margaret's nearest neighbors, Carl and Susan Patterson, who lived on the adjacent farm about 2 miles down the county road. Margaret saw their pickup truck approaching and felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in her stomach. The Pattersons were good people, but they'd been among the most persistent in suggesting that she sell the farm and move to town after Robert's death. Thomas looked up from his fence work as the truck pulled into the yard, his posture becoming noticeably more alert and defensive. Margaret realized that he probably had extensive experience with curious neighbors and the kind of assumptions that his appearance inevitably generated. "Stay close," she said quietly as she walked toward the approaching visitors. "I have a feeling this might get uncomfortable." Carl Patterson was a man in his early 60s who'd farmed successfully for most of his adult life, building an operation that was substantially larger and more profitable than Margaret's modest acreage. He was also someone who believed strongly in traditional ways of doing things and was generally suspicious of anything that didn't fit his understanding of how rural life should work. "Afternoon, Margaret," Carl said as he climbed out of his truck, his eyes already moving toward Thomas with obvious curiosity. "Susan and I thought we'd stop by and see how you're getting along." Susan Patterson was a kindly woman who'd been trying to take care of Margaret in her own way since Robert's funeral, though her efforts usually involved suggestions that Margaret should move closer to town where life would be easier and safer for a woman living alone. "Hello, Carl, Susan," Margaret replied, forcing herself to sound more confident than she felt. "I'm doing well, thank you. Been making some progress on repairs and maintenance that have been needed for a while." Carl's attention was clearly focused on Thomas, who had continued working on the fence posts, but was obviously listening to the conversation. Margaret could see Carl taking in details like Thomas's size, his unusual mask, and the professional quality of his work with the kind of analytical attention that farmers applied to evaluating livestock or equipment. "Heard you picked up some "Help at Henderson's auction last week," Carl said, his tone carefully neutral but his meaning clear. "Folks have been wondering about your new hired hand." Margaret felt her back stiffen at the implication that her business decisions were proper topics for community gossip and speculation. She'd known that hiring Thomas would generate curiosity and comment, but she'd hoped for at least a few weeks before having to defend her choices to nosy neighbors. "Thomas has been a tremendous help with projects I couldn't handle on my own," she said firmly. "He's skilled, hardworking, and respectful. I couldn't ask for better assistance." Susan Patterson stepped forward with the kind of concerned expression that Margaret had learned to dread over the past 8 months. "Oh, honey, we're not questioning your judgment. We're just worried about you living out here with a stranger, especially one who, well, you know." The unfinished sentence hung in the air, laden with all the prejudices and assumptions that Thomas had undoubtedly encountered countless times since his injury. Margaret felt anger rising in her chest, the kind of protective fury that surprised her with its intensity. "One who what, Susan?" Margaret asked, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. "One who's been nothing but courteous and helpful. One who's already done more to improve this farm in 10 days than I managed to accomplish in 8 months. One who served his country and got injured doing it." Carl Patterson shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that the conversation was heading in a direction he hadn't intended. "Now, Margaret, we're not trying to cause trouble. We're just concerned about your safety and well-being. You're living alone with a man nobody knows anything about, and people are naturally going to have questions." Thomas had stopped working entirely now and was standing quietly beside the fence line, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough away to avoid seeming threatening or confrontational. Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders and wondered how many similar conversations he'd endured. How many times he'd been discussed as if he weren't present or capable of speaking for himself. "You want to know about Thomas?" Margaret said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "He gets up every morning before dawn and has coffee and breakfast ready when I come downstairs. He's repaired fence posts, fixed the barn door, replaced broken windows, and cleaned out gutters that I couldn't reach safely. He's polite, considerate, and the hardest worker I've ever seen. What else do you need to know?" The passion in her defense seemed to surprise both the Pattersons and Thomas himself. Margaret realized that she'd moved beyond simple gratitude for his help into something that felt distinctly like loyalty and protectiveness. The idea that people would judge him based on his appearance rather than his character infuriated her more than she'd expected. Susan Patterson tried a different approach, her voice taking on the coaxing tone she might use with a confused child. "Margaret, dear, we understand that you appreciate his help, but you have to think about appearances. A widow woman living alone with a strange man, it just doesn't look proper. People are going to talk." "Let them talk," Margaret replied with more confidence than she'd felt in months. "I'm 62 years old, Susan. I'm too old to make decisions based on what the neighbors might think, and I'm too smart to let gossip interfere with the best thing that's happened to me since Robert died." The declaration surprised even Margaret with its vehemence. She hadn't realized until she spoke the words how much Thomas's presence had meant to her, how much his quiet competence and consideration had restored her sense of purpose and hope for the future. Carl Patterson glanced toward Thomas, who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange, then back at Margaret, with an expression that suggested he was beginning to understand that his concerns weren't going to be well received. "Well," he said finally, "I reckon you know your own mind, Margaret. Just want you to know that if you ever need anything, or if things don't work out the way you're hoping, Susan and I are just down the road." "I appreciate that, Carl," Margaret said, her tone softening slightly now that the immediate threat to Thomas seemed to be passing. "But I'm confident that things are going to work out just fine." After the Pattersons left, Margaret found Thomas back at work on the fence posts, his movements perhaps a bit more forceful than they'd been earlier. She could see the tension in his shoulders and suspected that the conversation had been difficult for him to witness, even though she'd tried to defend him. "Thank you," he said without looking up from his work. "For what?" "For standing up for me. For treating me like a person instead of a problem to be solved or a threat to be managed." Margaret moved closer, wanting him to see her sincerity, despite the mask that made reading his full expression impossible. "Thomas, you don't need to thank me for basic human decency. Anyone who can't see your worth isn't worth worrying about." "Not everyone feels that way," Thomas said quietly. "Most people see the mask and make assumptions about what kind of person I must be. Some think I'm dangerous, others think I'm mentally unstable, and a few think I'm just trying to get attention or sympathy." The pain in his voice made Margaret's chest tight with sympathy and anger at a world that could be so cruel to someone who'd sacrificed so much in service to others. She found herself wishing she could somehow undo the damage that had been done, not just to his face, but to his faith in human kindness and acceptance. "Their loss," she said firmly. "Anyone who judges you by your appearance is missing out on knowing someone remarkable." Thomas looked at her directly for the first time since the Pattersons had left, and Margaret thought she saw something like wonder in his visible expression. "You really mean that?" "I absolutely mean it. Thomas, in 10 days you've transformed this place from a farm that was falling apart to something I can be proud of again. You've been nothing but respectful and considerate. You work harder than anyone has a right to expect, and you've made me feel useful and hopeful for the first time in months. If people can't see how valuable you are, that's their blindness, not your inadequacy." The silence that followed her words was heavy with emotion. Thomas stood very still, as if he was trying to absorb the idea that someone could see him as valuable rather than burdensome, as an asset rather than a charity case. "I haven't felt valuable in a very long time," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at the admission. The idea that someone with Thomas's skills and character could be made to feel worthless because of physical scars seemed like a particularly cruel injustice in a world that was already full of unnecessary suffering. "Well, you are valuable," she said with determination. "And I'm going to keep telling you that until you believe it, regardless of what anyone else thinks or says." That evening, as they worked together to prepare dinner, Margaret noticed that Thomas seemed more relaxed than he'd been since his arrival. His movements in the kitchen were easier, his conversation came more freely, and he actually volunteered information about his day's work without being asked. "Got all the north boundary fence posts replaced," he reported as he helped her set the table. "Ground's still soft enough to work with, so I should be able to finish the west side tomorrow if the weather holds." "The difference is already dramatic," Margaret said, thinking about how much more secure and well-maintained her property looked with properly aligned fencing. "I should have tackled that project years ago, but it always seemed too overwhelming to handle alone." "It's a big job for one person," Thomas agreed. "Takes specialized tools and techniques to do it right. Your husband probably would have handled it himself if he'd been feeling well enough." It was the first time Thomas had mentioned Robert directly, and Margaret appreciated his acknowledgement that the farm's deterioration hadn't been due to negligence, but to circumstances beyond anyone's control. Robert had been sick for the last 2 years of his life, struggling with the kind of chronic illness that drained energy and hope while making normal activities increasingly difficult. Robert always said he was going to get to those fence posts. "Next summer," Margaret said with a sad smile. Every year it was next summer until finally there weren't any more summers for him. Thomas nodded understanding. "Sometimes life doesn't give us enough time to finish everything we intend to do. That's why it's important to appreciate the help we can get and give." The philosophical observation struck Margaret as particularly wise coming from someone who'd experienced as much loss and disappointment as Thomas had. Despite everything that had been taken from him, he still understood the importance of mutual support and cooperation, still believed in the value of working together toward common goals. "Is that how you ended up at Henderson's auction?" she asked gently, looking for an opportunity to help and be helped. Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering how much of his story he was ready to share. "I'd been staying at a veterans' shelter in Omaha, doing odd jobs when I could find them. The shelter coordinator heard about the auction and thought it might be a chance for someone to find steady work with room and board included. I didn't have many other options." The image of Thomas at a homeless shelter, struggling to find work and basic stability despite his skills and service record, made Margaret's heart ache with sympathy and outrage. The fact that a decorated veteran could end up in such circumstances seemed like a failure of the society he'd served so faithfully. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," she said sincerely. "No one who served their country should end up without basic security and support." "There are a lot of us in similar situations," Thomas said matter-of-factly. "Physical injuries, mental health issues, difficulty adjusting to civilian life. The support systems aren't always adequate for the challenges we face." Margaret wanted to ask more questions about his experiences, to understand better how the system had failed someone with his qualifications and dedication. But she sensed that pushing for too much information might be overwhelming, especially when they were still building trust and establishing the boundaries of their relationship. Instead, she focused on expressing gratitude for the opportunity to be part of his recovery and rebuilding process. "Well, I hope being here helps. I know it's helping me more than you probably realize." Thomas looked at her with curiosity. "How so?" Margaret considered how to explain the profound impact his presence had made on her daily life and emotional well-being. "Before you arrived, I was going through the motions of living without much purpose or hope. The farm was deteriorating. I was isolated and depressed, and I couldn't see any way forward that didn't involve giving up everything Robert and I had worked to build." She paused, trying to find words for feelings that were still developing and evolving. "Having you here has given me a sense of partnership and purpose that I didn't realize I was missing. We're building something together instead of just trying to maintain what's left of the past. That feels hopeful in a way I hadn't experienced in a very long time." Thomas listened to her explanation with the kind of focused attention he brought to everything important, his visible expression thoughtful and engaged. "I feel that too," he said finally. "Like we're creating something new instead of just trying to survive whatever comes next." The acknowledgement that their partnership was meaningful to him as well filled Margaret with a warmth and satisfaction that went beyond simple gratitude. They were both contributing to something that was greater than the sum of their individual efforts, building a foundation for a future that neither of them could have achieved alone. As October progressed into November, their daily routines became more comfortable and natural. Thomas continued to tackle major repair projects with impressive skill and efficiency, while Margaret handled household management and the administrative aspects of running the farm. They developed an easy rhythm of shared meals, collaborative planning, and companionable silence that felt like the kind of partnership that successful couples built over years of living together. Margaret found herself looking forward to their morning conversations over coffee, their shared lunches during break from work, and their evening discussions about the day's accomplishments and tomorrow's plans. Thomas's presence had transformed her house from a lonely monument to loss into a home where two people were actively building a life together. The transformation wasn't just emotional, but practical as well. Under Thomas's expert attention, the farm was becoming more functional and attractive than it had been in years. Fence lines were straight and secure, buildings were weatherproofed and properly maintained, and equipment was cleaned and organized for maximum efficiency. More importantly, Margaret was rediscovering aspects of herself that had been dormant since Robert's illness began consuming all her energy and attention. She found herself taking pride in meal preparation, planning improvements to the house and grounds, and thinking about future possibilities rather than just immediate survival. "You know," she said one evening as they worked together to preserve the last vegetables from her garden, "I haven't felt this optimistic about the future in years. It's like having a partner again has reminded me that life can be about building something instead of just enduring whatever happens." Thomas looked up from the tomatoes he was carefully slicing for canning, his expression thoughtful. "I know what you mean. I'd gotten used to thinking about life one day at a time, just trying to get through without causing problems for anyone. Having projects and plans and someone to share them with makes everything feel more meaningful." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching on the gravel drive. Margaret looked out the kitchen window to see a sheriff's department cruiser pulling up beside the house, its presence immediately filling her with anxiety about what kind of trouble might have found them. Thomas had noticed the patrol car as well, and Margaret could see him tense with the kind of wariness that probably came from experience with law enforcement encounters that hadn't gone well for someone in his situation. She realized that a masked man living with a widow woman might attract official attention from people who'd heard rumors and decided to investigate. "Stay calm," she said quietly as they both watched the uniformed officer climb out of his vehicle. "We haven't done anything wrong, and there's no reason for this to be a problem." But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful interlude was about to be disrupted by forces beyond their control, and that the trust and partnership they'd been building might be about to face its first serious test. Sheriff Daniel Morrison was a man Margaret had known peripherally for years through church functions and community events, though they'd never had occasion for extended conversation. He was in his late 40s, with graying hair and the kind of steady demeanor that suggested someone comfortable with authority, but not eager to abuse it. As he approached the front porch, Margaret noticed that his hand wasn't resting on his weapon, which she took as a positive sign. "Evening, Mrs. Thompson," Sheriff Morrison said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "Hope I'm not interrupting your dinner preparations." "Not at all, Sheriff," Margaret replied, stepping onto the porch while Thomas remained in the doorway behind her. "Is there something I can help you with?" Sheriff Morrison's eyes moved briefly to Thomas, taking in his imposing height and the black mask with the kind of professional assessment that law enforcement officers applied to potentially volatile situations. Margaret could see him cataloging details and making judgments about threat levels and appropriate responses. "I've had a few calls from concerned citizens about your new living arrangement," the sheriff said carefully. "Nothing specific, just people wondering about the welfare and safety of everyone involved. Thought I'd stop by and make sure everything's going smoothly." Margaret felt her temper rise at the realization that nosy neighbors had escalated their gossip to the point of involving law enforcement. The idea that people who barely knew her felt entitled to monitor her personal decisions and question her judgment was both infuriating and deeply insulting. "Everything is going very well, thank you," she said with forced politeness. "Thomas has been enormously helpful with farm maintenance and improvements. I couldn't be more satisfied with our arrangement." Sheriff Morrison nodded acknowledgement of her statement while continuing to study Thomas with obvious curiosity. Margaret realized that the sheriff had probably never encountered someone who wore a mask in normal daily life, and was trying to figure out how to handle the unusual circumstances without causing offense or escalating tensions. "Mr. Crowfeather," the sheriff said, addressing Thomas directly, "I understand you're a military veteran. Thank you for your service to our country." Thomas stepped forward slightly, his posture respectful but not submissive. "Thank you, Sheriff. I appreciate the recognition. Would you mind if I asked about your current legal status? Immigration documents, veterans identification, that sort of thing. Just routine questions to satisfy the folks who've been calling." Margaret could see Thomas tense at the request, probably anticipating the kind of bureaucratic hassles that had made his life difficult in the past. She moved slightly closer to him, a gesture of support that wasn't lost on Sheriff Morrison. "Of course," Thomas said, reaching into his back pocket to retrieve a worn leather wallet. "I have my military discharge papers, veteran's identification card, and Social Security documentation." He handed over the documents with the kind of careful cooperation that suggested extensive experience with official questioning. Sheriff Morrison examined each paper thoroughly, comparing the information against whatever criteria he used for such evaluations. "Everything appears to be in order," the sheriff said after several minutes of review. "Honorable discharge, decorated. Veteran, clean record. Can't ask for better credentials than that." Margaret felt some of her tension ease at the sheriff's positive assessment, though she remained angry that such an investigation had been necessary in the first place. The idea that Thomas's service record and character had to be verified to satisfy nosy neighbors seemed like a particularly unfair burden to place on someone who'd already sacrificed so much. "Is there anything else you need to know?" she asked, her tone making clear that she hoped the answer would be no. Sheriff Morrison looked between Margaret and Thomas, apparently satisfied that whatever concerns had prompted the visit were unfounded. "Just one more thing, if you don't mind me asking. The mask, is that related to your military service?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, and Margaret could see him deciding how much personal information he was willing to share with someone who was essentially a stranger investigating complaints about his presence in the community. "Combat injury," Thomas said finally. "Afghanistan. The mask makes social interactions easier for everyone involved." The sheriff's expression softened noticeably at this explanation, suggesting that he understood the implications of combat-related facial injuries and the challenges they created for veterans trying to reintegrate into civilian life. "I appreciate your candor," Sheriff Morrison said sincerely. "And again, thank you for your service. I'm sorry that your sacrifice has created difficulties for you in civilian life." Margaret felt her anger at the situation crystallize into something more focused and determined. The fact that a decorated veteran had to justify his presence in her home to satisfy the prejudices and assumptions of people who'd never made comparable sacrifices seemed like a fundamental injustice that demanded correction. "Sheriff Morrison," she said, her voice carrying more authority than she'd used in months, "I want you to know that any future complaints about my living arrangements or my choices regarding Thomas's presence here are completely without merit. He's been nothing but respectful, helpful, and honorable in every interaction we've had." The sheriff nodded understanding. "I'll make note of that in my report, Mrs. Thompson, and I'll make sure that anyone with future concerns understands that I've personally verified that there are no issues requiring law enforcement attention." After Sheriff Morrison left, Margaret and Thomas returned to their kitchen tasks in silence. Margaret could see that the encounter had shaken Thomas more than he was willing to admit, reminding him of his vulnerability to official scrutiny and community judgment in ways that probably brought back difficult memories of previous rejections and investigations. "I'm sorry that happened," Margaret said as they worked side by side preparing vegetables for preservation. "People had no right to involve the sheriff in our private business." Thomas shrugged, trying to project indifference he clearly didn't feel. "I'm used to it. Anywhere I go, people have questions and concerns about having someone like me in their community." At least the sheriff was professional about it. The resignation in his voice broke Margaret's heart. The idea that Thomas had to expect and accept this kind of scrutiny as a normal part of his life seemed like a terrible burden to carry on top of everything else he'd endured. "Well, you shouldn't have to be used to it," Margaret said firmly. "And you shouldn't have to prove your worth to people who haven't done half of what you've done for this country." Thomas looked at her with what might have been gratitude mixed with surprise, as if he wasn't accustomed to having someone defend him so passionately. "Most people don't see it that way. They see the mask and assume I'm hiding something dangerous or shameful." Margaret set down her knife and turned to face him fully, wanting him to see her sincerity despite the limitations imposed by his mask. "Thomas, I need you to understand something. Since you've been here, I've watched you work with dedication and skill that most people couldn't match. I've seen you treat my property and my belongings with more respect than some family members have shown. I've eaten meals you prepared with thoughtfulness and care, and I've had conversations with you that have been more meaningful than most of the social interactions I've had in years." She paused, searching for words that could convey the depth of her conviction. "If people can't see past your appearance to recognize your character, that's their loss and their shame, not yours. You have nothing to be ashamed of and everything to be proud of." The silence that followed her declaration was heavy with emotion. Thomas stood very still, as if he was trying to absorb the idea that someone could see him as worthy of respect and admiration rather than suspicion and pity. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice thick with feeling. "I haven't heard anything like that in longer than I care to remember." Margaret reached out and touched his hand briefly, a gesture of comfort and connection that she hoped conveyed what words couldn't express adequately. "You'll hear it from me as often as you need to, for as long as you're willing to stay." The next morning brought news that would test their growing partnership in ways neither of them anticipated. Margaret was reviewing her monthly bills when she discovered a letter from the county tax assessor's office informing her that her property tax assessment had been increased by 40%, effective immediately, due to what the letter described as improvements that had increased the property's value substantially. "Thomas," she called, her voice tight with anxiety. "Could you come look at this, please?" Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway, took one look at her expression, and moved quickly to read over her shoulder as she spread the tax documents across the table. His reaction was immediate and concerned. "This doesn't make sense," he said after studying the assessment details. "The improvements we've made are maintenance and repairs, not additions that would increase property value this significantly. Someone's either made a major error or they're deliberately targeting you." Margaret felt her stomach clench with familiar fear about financial pressures she couldn't afford to handle. The increased tax burden would consume most of her remaining savings and make it impossible to continue paying Thomas even the modest wages they'd agreed upon. "Can they do this?" she asked, hoping Thomas might have experience with similar bureaucratic challenges. "Can they just decide your property is worth more and demand additional payments?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, studying the documents with the kind of analytical attention he brought to structural problems around the farm. "They can reassess property values, but it's supposed to be based on actual market conditions and comparable sales, not arbitrary decisions about improvements." He pointed to specific sections of the assessment that seemed particularly questionable. "Look at this. They're claiming that fence repairs and barn maintenance have increased your property value by $15,000. That's not how agricultural property assessment typically works." Margaret felt a spark of hope at Thomas's confident analysis of the situation. His military background and life experience had apparently included exposure to bureaucratic processes and legal procedures that she knew nothing about. "So what can we do about it?" she asked. "We can appeal the assessment," Thomas said without hesitation. "But we'll need documentation of the actual work that's been done, estimates of the costs involved, and comparable property values in the area to demonstrate that the reassessment is unreasonable." The use of "we" in his response filled Margaret with gratitude and relief. Thomas was automatically including himself in the challenge, treating her problem as their shared concern rather than something he might choose to help with if convenient. Over the next several days, Thomas threw himself into researching property, tax law and assessment procedures with the same methodical dedication he brought to physical labor. He spent hours at the county courthouse examining records, drove throughout the area photographing comparable properties, and compiled detailed documentation of every repair and improvement they'd made to Margaret's farm. The good news is that your reassessment is clearly excessive compared to similar properties, Thomas reported after 3 days of intensive investigation. I found 6 farms within 5 miles that have similar acreage and improvements, and none of them have been reassessed at anywhere near the level they're claiming for yours. Margaret felt her anxiety begin to ease slightly at Thomas's confident assessment. So we have a good case for appeal? We have an excellent case, Thomas said firmly. But there's something else I discovered that you need to know about. His tone suggested that the additional information wasn't going to be welcome news. Margaret braced herself for whatever complication he'd uncovered. 3 other properties in this area have received similar reassessments in the past 6 months. Thomas continued. All of them are farms owned by elderly people or widows living alone. All of the reassessments were excessive compared to actual property values, and all of them resulted in the owners selling their land because they couldn't afford the increased tax burden. The pattern Thomas described sent a chill through Margaret's chest. The idea that someone might be systematically targeting vulnerable property owners with inflated tax assessments as a way to force them to sell was both terrifying and infuriating. You think someone's deliberately trying to force me off my land? She asked. I think someone's using the tax assessment process as a weapon against people who can't afford to fight back, Thomas said grimly. It's a sophisticated operation that probably involves cooperation from someone inside the assessor's office. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the implications of what Thomas was suggesting. Fighting a corrupt bureaucratic conspiracy was far beyond anything she'd ever imagined having to deal with, and the costs of legal representation would probably exceed her ability to pay even if she won the case. What do we do? She asked, hearing the despair in her own voice. Thomas reached across the table and took her hands in his touch warm and reassuring despite the disturbing information he'd just shared. We fight back. We document everything. We file formal appeals with every appropriate agency, and we make sure that whoever's behind this understands that you're not going to be intimidated into giving up your home. The determination in his voice reminded Margaret of why she'd been drawn to him from the beginning. Despite everything he'd lost and endured, Thomas still believed in fighting for what was right, still had the courage to stand up against injustice even when the odds seemed overwhelming. It's going to be expensive, Margaret said practically. Legal fees, filing costs, time away from farm work. I'm not sure I can afford to fight this properly. You're not fighting it alone, Thomas said simply. We're fighting it together. And we'll find a way to make it work. The commitment in his words brought tears to Margaret's eyes. In just 6 weeks, this man who'd been sold at an auction for 50 cents had become more loyal and supportive than family members who'd known her for decades. That afternoon, Thomas drove to the county seat to file their formal appeal and request copies of all documentation related to Margaret's reassessment. He returned with a stack of papers and a grim expression that suggested the battle was going to be more complicated than either of them had hoped. The clerk at the assessor's office was extremely uncooperative, Thomas reported. Claimed that most of the documentation I requested was confidential, tried to discourage me from filing the appeal, and made several comments about people who don't understand how property assessment works. Margaret could see the anger in Thomas's posture despite his attempt to remain calm and factual in his report. She suspected that the clerk's attitude had included the kind of assumptions and dismissiveness that Thomas encountered regularly because of his appearance. Did you get the appeal filed? She asked. I got it filed, but they made it clear that the process is going to involve multiple hearings, extensive documentation, and probably several months of bureaucratic delays. They're hoping we'll give up and pay the inflated assessment rather than fight through their deliberately complicated procedures. Margaret felt her determination harden in response to what Thomas had described. The idea that corrupt officials expected her to surrender her home without a fight because the process was designed to be intimidating and expensive was exactly the kind of bullying that made her fighting spirit emerge. "Then we'll give them a fight they're not expecting," she said with more confidence than she'd felt in months. "What do we need to do first?" Thomas smiled at her response, the first genuine expression of pleasure she'd seen from him since the tax crisis began. "First, we need to document everything more thoroughly than they expect. Photographs, measurements, cost estimates, comparable sales data. We need to build a case that's so comprehensive and well-researched that they can't dismiss it or ignore it." Over the following weeks, Margaret and Thomas worked together with the kind of focused intensity that transformed their partnership from domestic cooperation into something that felt distinctly like a military campaign. Thomas brought his engineering background and analytical skills to bear on every aspect of their case, while Margaret contributed her knowledge of local history and community connections that provided crucial context for their arguments. They spent long evenings at the kitchen table, surrounded by documents and photographs and legal forms, building their defense with meticulous attention to every detail that might influence the outcome of their appeal. Margaret found herself amazed by Thomas's combination of technical expertise and strategic thinking, skills that suggested he'd been trained for much more complex challenges than farm maintenance and property tax disputes. "Where did you learn to research legal issues so thoroughly?" she asked one evening as they organized evidence for their presentation to the appeal board. Thomas looked up from the comparative property analysis he was completing, his expression thoughtful. "Army taught me that preparation and documentation win battles more often than strength or courage. If you can prove your case with facts and evidence, you don't have to rely on luck or sympathy." The military perspective he brought to their civilian problem was both reassuring and effective. Thomas approached their tax appeal with the same systematic preparation he would have applied to a combat engineering project, leaving nothing to chance and anticipating every possible objection or complication. As December approached, their case file had grown to include hundreds of pages of documentation, photographs of every improvement made to the property, detailed cost analyses of all materials and labor, and comprehensive comparisons with similar properties throughout the county. Thomas had also uncovered additional evidence suggesting that the pattern of excessive reassessments was more widespread than they'd initially realized. "I found records of 12 properties that have been reassessed at inflated values in the past 18 months, Thomas reported during one of their evening planning sessions. "All of them are owned by people over 60. All of them involve properties that are potentially valuable for development, and 10 of the 12 owners have sold rather than fight the increased tax burden." The scope of what appeared to be a systematic campaign to force certain property owners to sell was both shocking and deeply disturbing. Margaret realized that her individual case was part of a much larger conspiracy that probably involved significant financial interests and political connections. "This is bigger than just my farm," she said, feeling overwhelmed by the implications of what Thomas had discovered. "Much bigger," Thomas agreed, "but that actually works in our favor. If we can prove that there's a pattern of corruption and abuse, it becomes a scandal that officials can't ignore or cover up. Individual cases might be dismissed, but systematic fraud is a criminal matter that attracts media attention and political consequences." Margaret looked at Thomas with growing admiration for his strategic thinking and determination to see justice done, despite the personal risks involved. Fighting corruption required courage that went beyond simple self-defense, and she was grateful to have someone with his integrity and skills as her ally. "Are you sure you want to take this on?" she asked. "I mean, if we're talking about corruption and criminal activity, there could be retaliation against people who threaten the operation." Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Seriously. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of conviction that came from deeply held principles rather than temporary emotion. "Margaret, I've spent the last 2 years feeling like I didn't have anything valuable to contribute to the world. My military career was ended by enemy action, I lost my family's land while I was overseas, and most people see me as either a charity case or a potential threat. He gestured toward the documents that covered their kitchen table, evidence of weeks of intensive investigation and preparation. This is the first time since my injury that I felt like I was fighting for something that really mattered, alongside someone who saw me as a partner instead of a burden. If there are risks involved, then we'll face them together. Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion at Thomas's declaration. The idea that their partnership had restored his sense of purpose and value touched her more deeply than any romantic gesture could have. They were building something together that was larger than either of their individual needs, creating a team that was stronger and more capable than the sum of its parts. Together then, she said, reaching across the table to clasp his hand. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. The first hearing of their tax appeal was scheduled for the week before Christmas, which Thomas suspected was a deliberate attempt to minimize public attention and media coverage during the holiday season. He spent the days leading up to the hearing preparing Margaret for what to expect and rehearsing their presentation until every argument was clear and compelling. "Remember," he said the night before their appearance before the appeal board, "we're not asking for favors or sympathy. We're presenting evidence that proves their assessment is factually incorrect and legally unsupportable. Stay calm, stick to the facts, and don't let them make this about anything other than the documentation we've compiled." Margaret nodded, trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. The thought of facing a room full of officials who might be corrupt or biased was intimidating. But Thomas's thorough preparation had given her the tools she needed to present their case effectively. "What if they've already decided against us before we even present our evidence?" she asked. "Then we'll have created a comprehensive record for the next level of appeal," Thomas replied pragmatically. "But I don't think they're expecting the level of preparation and documentation we've put together. Most people who appeal these assessments do it without professional help and with minimal supporting evidence. We're going to surprise them with the thoroughness of our case." The morning of the hearing, Thomas appeared at breakfast wearing clothes that Margaret had never seen before, a dark suit that transformed his appearance from rural laborer to professional consultant. The change was so dramatic that it took her a moment to recognize him, though the mask remained the same constant presence it had been since his arrival. "You look very professional," Margaret said, meaning it as a compliment. "Where did that suit come from?" Thomas looked slightly embarrassed. "Had it cleaned and pressed at the dry cleaners in town. Figured we should look as serious and prepared as our case actually is." The attention to detail impressed Margaret yet again. Thomas understood that their appearance and presentation would influence how their arguments were received, and he'd taken steps to ensure that nothing about their presentation would undermine the strength of their evidence. At the county courthouse, they were directed to a small conference room where 3 members of the tax appeal board were seated behind a long table covered with official documents and legal forms. Margaret recognized one of the board members as someone she'd seen at community events, though she'd never had occasion to speak with him directly. "Good morning," said the board chairman, a thin man in his 60s who introduced himself as Howard Fleming. "We're here to review the appeal filed by Margaret Thompson regarding the reassessment of property located at 4847 County Road 15. Mrs. Thompson, I understand you have representation today. Thomas Crowfeather is assisting me with my appeal," Margaret replied, proud of how steady her voice sounded despite her nervousness. Fleming's eyes moved to Thomas, taking in his unusual appearance with obvious curiosity but professional courtesy. "Very well. You have 30 minutes to present your case, after which we'll ask questions and deliberate on our decision." Thomas stood and moved to the front of the room, carrying a briefcase that contained organized copies of all their evidence. His transformation from shy farm worker to confident advocate was so complete that Margaret wondered if he'd had experience with formal presentations during his military career. "Gentlemen," Thomas began, his voice clear and authoritative, "we're here today because Mrs. Thompson received a property tax reassessment that is not only excessive, but appears to be part of a systematic pattern of inflated assessments, targeting vulnerable property owners throughout this county." The directness of his opening statement seemed to surprise the board members, who probably expected a more deferential approach from someone appealing their decision. Thomas continued without giving them time to interrupt or object. "Our presentation today will demonstrate 3 key points. First, that the improvements made to Mrs. Thompson's property are routine maintenance items that do not justify a 40% increase in assessed value. Second, that comparable properties in the immediate area have not received similar reassessments despite having similar or superior improvements. And third, that Mrs. Thompson's case is part of a documented pattern suggesting systematic abuse of the assessment process." Margaret watched the board members' faces as Thomas laid out their argument with military precision, supporting each point with specific documentation and photographic evidence. She could see them beginning to realize that they were dealing with someone who had done his homework far more thoroughly than they'd anticipated. For the next 25 minutes, Thomas systematically demolished every justification for the inflated assessment, presenting evidence that was so comprehensive and well organized that the board members found themselves taking notes and asking for copies of documents they hadn't expected to see. "In conclusion," Thomas said, returning to his position at the front of the room, "we respectfully request that Mrs. Thompson's property assessment be returned to its previous level, which accurately reflects both the property's actual value and its appropriate place within the county's assessment structure." The silence that followed Thomas's presentation was heavy with the kind of tension that suggested the board members were struggling to find ways to dismiss evidence that had been presented more professionally than most cases they encountered from licensed attorneys. "This is quite a comprehensive presentation," Fleming said finally. "We'll need time to review all of this documentation and compare it with our own records. We'll have a decision for you within 2 weeks." As they left the courthouse, Margaret felt simultaneously proud of Thomas's performance and anxious about the outcome of their appeal. The board members had seemed impressed by their preparation, but she couldn't shake the feeling that politics and corruption might override facts and evidence. "How do you think it went?" she asked as they drove home through the cold December afternoon. Thomas was quiet for a moment, apparently reviewing the hearing in his mind. "Better than I expected in terms of their reaction to our evidence. Worse than I hoped in terms of their willingness to make a decision today. The fact that they're delaying suggests they need time to figure out how to handle a case they weren't prepared for." Margaret nodded understanding. The 2-week delay would extend their uncertainty through the Christmas holidays, but at least they'd presented their case as effectively as possible. That evening, as they sat in the living room reviewing the day's events, Margaret found herself studying Thomas with new appreciation for capabilities she was still discovering. His transformation from mysterious auction purchase to skilled advocate had revealed depths of intelligence and experience that continued to surprise her. "Thomas," she said impulsively, "I need to tell you something important." He looked up from the legal documents he was organizing, his attention immediately focused on her words. "When I bid 50 cents for you at that auction, I thought I was taking a desperate chance on someone who might be able to help with farm work. I had no idea I was getting a partner who would fight for me the way you fought today." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, as if he was processing the implications of what she'd said. "When I stepped onto that auction block, I thought I was accepting charity from someone who felt sorry for a damaged veteran. I had no idea I was going to find someone who would see me as worth defending and supporting." The acknowledgement that their partnership had exceeded both of their expectations hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them was quite ready to examine directly. Margaret realized that somewhere in the process of fighting for her farm, They'd stopped being a widow and her hired help and started being something much more significant. "Whatever happens with the appeal," she said softly, "I want you to know that having you here has been the best thing that's happened to me in years." Thomas moved closer to her on the couch, his presence warm and reassuring in the lamplight of her living room. "Margaret, can I tell you something that I probably should have said weeks ago?" She nodded, her heart beginning to beat faster at the serious tone in his voice. "This place, this partnership, this life we've been building together, it's given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope for the future, pride in meaningful work, and someone who sees me as valuable rather than damaged." He paused, as if gathering courage for what he wanted to say next. "I know our arrangement started as a practical solution to both of our problems, but it's become something much more important to me than that." Margaret felt her breath catch at the implication in his words. The idea that Thomas might have developed feelings that went beyond gratitude and professional respect was both thrilling and terrifying, opening possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to consider. "What are you saying?" she asked gently. Thomas reached for her hands, his touch conveying what his masked face couldn't fully express. "I'm saying that I've fallen in love with you, Margaret. Not just with your kindness or your willingness to give me a chance, but with who you are as a person and who we are together." The declaration hung between them like a bridge that would either connect them permanently or collapse under the weight of complications and uncertainties. Margaret looked into his eyes, seeing vulnerability and hope and the kind of deep affection that couldn't be faked or manufactured. "Thomas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I've fallen in love with you too." The admission felt both natural and revolutionary, acknowledging feelings that had been growing steadily since their first morning sharing coffee and conversation. What had started as mutual necessity had evolved into genuine partnership, and partnership had deepened into love that neither of them had been looking for, but both desperately needed. Thomas leaned forward and touched his forehead to hers, the mask creating an unusual but intimate connection that spoke of trust and acceptance that went beyond physical appearance. "I need you to understand something," he said quietly. "I may never be able to take this mask off in public. My face is badly scarred, and most people find it disturbing to look at. If we're together, you'll be partnered with someone who will always be seen as different and possibly frightening." Margaret reached up and touched the leather ties that secured his mask, her fingers gentle but deliberate. "Thomas, would you trust me enough to let me see what you're so afraid of people looking at?" The request hung between them heavy with significance. Margaret understood that she was asking him to reveal not just his physical scars, but the vulnerability he'd been protecting since his injury. It was a level of trust that went to the core of everything that had kept him isolated from normal human connection. Thomas was very still for a long moment, clearly wrestling with fears that had controlled his interactions with other people for years. When he finally nodded consent, his hands were trembling slightly as he reached up to untie the leather cords that held his mask in place. The mask fell away to reveal scars that were indeed extensive, covering the left side of his face from his temple to his jaw with the kind of twisted skin that spoke of severe burns and multiple surgeries. But what Margaret saw wasn't the monster that Thomas feared people would see. What she saw was the face of someone who had endured unimaginable pain and emerged with his essential humanity intact. "You're beautiful," she said simply, meaning it completely. Thomas's eyes filled with tears at her acceptance, years of shame and isolation cracking apart in the face of unconditional love that saw past physical damage to the person he truly was. "How can you say that?" he whispered. "Because I'm looking at the face of someone who sacrificed for his country, who's worked harder than anyone should have to just to survive, and who's shown me more kindness and partnership than I ever expected to find again. The scars are just evidence of your courage and survival, not flaws that make you less valuable." Margaret reached up and traced one of the scars gently with her fingertip, her touch conveying acceptance that words couldn't fully express. "This is the face of the man I love, and I think it's perfect exactly as it is." The kiss that followed was tender and careful, full of years of loneliness and hope finally finding expression in connection that neither of them had believed possible. It tasted like coffee and trust and the promise of a future they could build together without pretense or shame. The decision letter arrived on a gray January morning that matched Margaret's mood as she tore open the official envelope from the county tax board. Thomas sat across from her at the kitchen table, his coffee growing cold as he watched her face change from hope to disappointment to outright anger while she read the brief, formal rejection of their appeal. "Denied," Margaret said, her voice tight with frustration. "They claim our evidence was insufficient to warrant a reduction in assessed value, and they're upholding the original reassessment." Thomas reached for the letter, scanning the bureaucratic language that dismissed weeks of meticulous research and documentation with vague references to standard procedures and insufficient grounds for adjustment. His jaw tightened as he recognized the kind of institutional dismissal that had nothing to do with facts and everything to do with protecting predetermined decisions. "This doesn't address any of the specific evidence we presented," he said, his voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who understood exactly what they were facing. "They're not even pretending to have reviewed our documentation seriously." Margaret felt the familiar weight of financial pressure settling over her like a heavy blanket. The increased tax assessment would consume her remaining savings within 6 months, leaving her unable to afford basic maintenance on the farm, much less the modest wages she'd been paying Thomas for his invaluable work. "What do we do now?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would involve expenses and complications she couldn't afford to handle. Thomas was quiet for several minutes, studying the rejection letter with the kind of focused attention he brought to structural problems that required creative solutions. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a determination that reminded Margaret why she'd fallen in love with his character as much as his dedication. "We take this to the state level," he said firmly, "and we contact the media about the pattern of corruption we've documented. Sometimes public pressure accomplishes what legal appeals can't." The prospect of involving reporters and state officials in their private struggles made Margaret's stomach clench with anxiety. She'd always been a private person who preferred to handle problems within her family and community rather than seeking outside intervention that might create more complications than solutions. "Thomas, I'm not sure I'm brave enough for that kind of public attention," she admitted. "What if we make things worse by challenging people who have more power and resources than we do?" Thomas moved his chair closer to hers, his presence offering comfort and strength that had become essential to her ability to face each day's challenges. "Margaret, we've already made them angry by refusing to give up quietly. At this point, our choice is between fighting publicly where they have to justify their actions, or surrendering privately while they continue to target other vulnerable people." The moral dimension of their struggle hadn't been lost on Margaret, but Thomas's clear articulation of the stakes involved helped her understand that their individual case had implications far beyond her personal financial situation. They were fighting for the principle that corruption shouldn't be allowed to destroy people's lives simply because the victims lacked resources to defend themselves effectively. "You're right," she said, feeling her resolve strengthen despite her fears. "If we don't fight this, they'll just keep doing it to other people who can't afford to lose their homes." Thomas nodded approval of her decision, then surprised her by pulling out a notebook where he'd apparently been developing plans for exactly this scenario. "I've been researching investigative reporters who specialize in government corruption stories. There's a journalist at the state paper who's won awards for exposing local political scandals." Margaret marveled once again at Thomas's thorough preparation and strategic thinking. While she'd been hoping their initial appeal would resolve everything quietly, he'd been planning for the possibility that they would need to escalate their fight to higher levels of publicity and official attention. What would we need to do? She asked. First, we file appeals with the State Tax Commission and the Attorney General's office, Thomas explained, consulting his notes. Then we contact this reporter, Jennifer Walsh, and offer her exclusive access to all the documentation we've compiled about the systematic assessment fraud. The plan sounded simultaneously promising and terrifying to Margaret. The idea of seeing her personal business discussed in newspaper articles and potentially on television news programs was deeply uncomfortable. But she understood that privacy was a luxury she couldn't afford if it meant losing her home and allowing corruption to continue unchallenged. How long would all of this take? She asked practically. Thomas consulted his timeline notes. State appeals usually take 3 to 6 months. Media investigations can move faster if the story is compelling enough. The key is timing everything so that public pressure supports our legal arguments rather than interfering with them. That afternoon, Thomas drove to the state capitol to file their appeals with higher authorities, while Margaret remained at the farm to handle the daily work that couldn't be postponed while they fought bureaucratic battles. The division of labor felt natural and efficient, with each of them contributing their strongest skills to their shared challenge. When Thomas returned that evening, he brought news that was both encouraging and ominous. The State Tax Commission clerk said they've received several similar appeals from this county in recent months. That suggests we're not the only people who've recognized the pattern and decided to fight back. Margaret felt a flicker of hope at the implication that other victims were challenging the corrupt assessment system. That's good for our case, right? It's good for proving systematic abuse, Thomas agreed. But it also means that whoever's behind this scheme is going to be even more motivated to silence complaints before the pattern becomes a public scandal. The threat implicit in Thomas's observation sent a chill through Margaret's chest. She had focused on the money and legal parts of their fight, without thinking that people doing systematic fraud might use threats or worse to protect their illegal business. Are you saying we might be in physical danger? She asked. Thomas stayed quiet for a moment, clearly thinking about how much of his worries he should share. I'm saying that people who steal money through official corruption usually have connections to other people who will protect that money flow through whatever means they need to use. The conversation stopped when they heard vehicles coming to the farm, multiple engines that meant more visitors than Margaret usually got. Thomas moved right away to the window, his body becoming alert and defensive in a way that reminded Margaret of his military background. 3 trucks, all with plates from other states, he said, his voice taking on the sharp tone he used when checking for threats. Men getting out of each vehicle doesn't look like a friendly visit. Margaret joined him at the window, her heart beating faster as she watched 6 men in expensive suits walking toward her front porch with the kind of planned coordination that suggested professional training. These were not neighbors or county officials. These were people who meant business, of a type that probably would not be pleasant. Stay behind me, Thomas said quietly, moving toward the front door with movements that reminded Margaret that he had been trained for combat situations that were far more dangerous than anything they would likely face in rural Nebraska. The knock on the door was firm and commanding, the kind of sound that demanded immediate attention and obedience. Thomas opened the door part way, his tall height and broad shoulders filling the doorway in a way that made clear he was not scared by whatever these visitors represented. "Good evening," said the apparent leader of the group, a man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of expensive clothing that suggested significant financial resources. "I'm Robert Carlson, and I represent certain business interests that are concerned about the recent legal actions you have started regarding property tax assessments." Thomas did not move from the doorway or invite the men inside, keeping a defensive position that forced them to do their business from the porch. Mrs. Thompson's legal appeals are a matter of public record. If you have concerns about them, you should address those concerns through proper legal channels. Carlson's smile was cold and completely without warmth or genuine friendliness. "I'm afraid this situation has moved beyond legal channels, Mr. Crowfeather. Mrs. Thompson's continued resistance to reasonable tax assessments is creating problems for people who have significant investments in this area's development potential." The barely hidden threat was clear, and Margaret felt her anger begin to override her fear. The idea that wealthy investors thought they could scare her into leaving her home so they could profit from forced property sales was exactly the kind of bullying that brought out her most stubborn and defiant instincts. "Mr. Carlson," she said, stepping forward to stand beside Thomas, "this is my home and my land. I'm not interested in your development potential or your investment concerns. I'm interested in fair treatment under the law and honest government that doesn't allow corruption to steal people's property." Carlson's expression got harder at her direct challenge to his authority and clear accusation of corruption. "Mrs. Thompson, I think you misunderstand the seriousness of your situation. Property taxes are just one of many regulatory requirements that can make rural life very expensive and complicated for people who don't have the resources to handle bureaucratic challenges." Thomas stepped slightly forward, his presence becoming more openly threatening despite his calm manner. "Are you suggesting that Mrs. Thompson might face additional harassment if she continues to exercise her legal rights?" "I'm suggesting that stubborn people who refuse to accept reasonable offers sometimes find themselves facing problems they didn't expect," Carlson replied, his tone making clear that the conversation had moved from negotiation to intimidation. Margaret felt Thomas tense beside her, his military training probably giving him multiple options for dealing with threats that she could not even imagine. But she also understood that violence would only make their situation worse in directions that might make everything much worse. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying more authority than she had known she possessed, "you have delivered your message. Now I suggest you leave my property before this conversation becomes something that requires law enforcement attention." The standoff continued for several tense seconds before Carlson apparently decided that further intimidation would not be productive. "Very well, Mrs. Thompson, but I hope you will think carefully about the consequences of continued resistance to reasonable business arrangements." After the men left, Margaret and Thomas remained at the window watching their vehicles disappear down the county road. The encounter had shaken both of them, but it had also made clear exactly what they were fighting against and why their struggle mattered beyond their individual circumstances. "Well," Margaret said, trying to add some lightness to the heavy atmosphere, "I guess we know we are on the right track if we are making powerful people nervous enough to send intimidation squads." Thomas was not smiling. "Margaret, these people are serious. The fact that they found us so quickly after our state appeals were filed suggests they have connections inside government offices that keep them informed about potential threats to their operation." The implications of what Thomas was suggesting made Margaret's stomach tighten with renewed anxiety. If corrupt officials were feeding information to criminal investors, then their legal appeals might be creating more danger than protection. "So what do we do?" she asked. "Give up and let them steal my farm?" "Absolutely not," Thomas said with fierce determination. "But we need to be smarter about how we fight back. We need allies who cannot be intimidated or bought, and we need to move faster than they expect." That evening, Thomas made a phone call that would change the direction of their entire struggle. He contacted Jennifer Walsh, the investigative reporter he'd researched, and arranged a meeting for the following day. His conversation with her lasted over an hour, and Margaret could hear the excitement in his voice as he described their documentation and the threats they'd received. "She's very interested," Thomas reported after ending the call. "Says this fits a pattern she's been investigating in 3 other counties. And our documentation is more comprehensive than anything she's seen before. She wants to meet tomorrow and review everything we've compiled." Margaret felt a mixture of relief and apprehension at the prospect of involving a professional. journalists and their private struggle. Media attention would provide protection against further intimidation, but it would also make their fight completely public in ways that couldn't be undone. "Are you sure this is the right approach?" she asked. Thomas took her hands in his touch conveying the same confidence and support that had sustained her through months of challenges. "Margaret, these people came to our home tonight to threaten us because they're afraid of what we might accomplish through legal channels. That tells me we have more power than they want us to realize." The next morning brought Jennifer Walsh, a woman in her early 40s with the kind of sharp intelligence and focused energy that Margaret associated with people who were very good at their jobs. She spent 3 hours reviewing Thomas's documentation, asking detailed questions, and taking photographs of evidence that supported their claims about systematic assessment fraud. "This is exactly what I've been looking for," Walsh said as she organized copies of their research. "I've been investigating similar patterns in other rural counties, but I hadn't found anyone with the documentation skills and persistence to build a case this comprehensive." Margaret felt a surge of pride in Thomas's abilities and dedication. His military training and engineering background had produced evidence that a professional investigative reporter considered exceptional, validating months of intensive work that had often felt overwhelming and potentially futile. "What happens next?" Thomas asked. Walsh consulted her notes and timeline. "I need about 2 weeks to verify your research independently and interview officials in other counties where similar fraud has occurred. Then we publish a series of articles that exposes the entire operation and puts pressure on law enforcement to investigate criminal charges." The prospect of seeing their private struggle transformed into a major news story was both thrilling and terrifying for Margaret. She understood that media attention would provide protection and potentially help other victims, but it would also make her personal business completely public in ways that felt deeply uncomfortable. "Will our names be in the articles?" she asked. "Your case will be featured prominently because your documentation is so thorough," Walsh replied. "But I'll focus on the systematic fraud rather than personal details. You'll be presented as citizens who discovered corruption and had the courage to fight back, not as victims seeking sympathy." That afternoon, after Walsh left to begin her independent investigation, Margaret and Thomas sat in their kitchen discussing how dramatically their lives were about to change. Media attention would bring scrutiny and publicity that neither of them had sought, but it might also provide the pressure necessary to achieve justice. "Are you ready for this?" Thomas asked, his voice gentle but serious. Margaret looked around the kitchen where they'd shared so many meals and conversations, where they'd planned their defense and fallen in love, where they'd built a partnership that had become the foundation for everything they were fighting to protect. "I'm ready," she said with conviction that surprised her. "These people think they can steal from vulnerable families because no one will fight back effectively. It's time to prove them wrong." Thomas smiled at her response, the expression transforming his scarred face in ways that reminded Margaret why she'd fallen in love with his character and determination. "Then let's show them what happens when they target people who refuse to be intimidated." The waiting period while Walsh conducted her investigation was filled with tension and anticipation. Margaret and Thomas continued their daily routines of farm maintenance and household management, but both of them were constantly aware that their lives were about to be changed by forces beyond their control. 2 weeks later, Walsh called to report that her investigation had uncovered evidence of corruption that extended far beyond what even Thomas had discovered. This involves at least 4 counties, dozens of fraudulent assessments, and what appears to be a network of investors who've been systematically targeting rural property owners for forced sales. Margaret felt her heart race at the scope of what Walsh had uncovered. How big is this story going to be? Front page of the Sunday edition, followed by a week-long series of investigative articles, Walsh replied. The state attorney general's office has already indicated they'll be opening a criminal investigation based on the evidence we've compiled. The magnitude of what they'd accomplished through their individual act of resistance was almost overwhelming for Margaret to process. What had started as a desperate attempt to save her farm had evolved into a major investigation that might protect hundreds of other property owners from similar fraud. "When will the first article appear?" Thomas asked. "This Sunday," Walsh said. "I wanted to give you advance warning so you can prepare for the attention this is going to generate. Your phone is probably going to ring constantly for the next few days." That evening, as Margaret and Thomas prepared dinner together in the kitchen that had become the center of their shared life, both of them were quiet with the weight of anticipation and uncertainty about what the next few days would bring. "Whatever happens," Margaret said as they sat down to eat, "I want you to know that I couldn't have fought this battle alone. Having you as my partner has made all the difference." Thomas reached across the table to take her hand, his touch warm and reassuring despite the uncertainty they were facing. "Margaret, fighting alongside you has given me back my sense of purpose and self-respect. Whatever the outcome, we've built something together that no one can take away from us." The Sunday morning that would change everything dawned clear and cold, with the kind of bright winter sunlight that made the Nebraska landscape look deceptively peaceful and simple. Margaret and Thomas drove to town early to buy copies of the newspaper, both of them nervous about seeing their private struggle transformed into public news. The headline dominated the front page: "Rural Property Tax Fraud Targets Elderly Landowners." Below, it was a photograph of Margaret's farm that made her property look prosperous and well-maintained rather than the struggling operation she'd feared people would see. Thomas read portions of the article aloud as they sat in Margaret's pickup truck outside the newspaper office, his voice filled with amazement at how professionally their story had been presented. Walsh had focused on the systematic nature of the fraud while portraying Margaret and Thomas as determined citizens who'd uncovered corruption through careful investigation and persistence. "Listen to this," Thomas said, reading from the article. "Mrs. Thompson and her partner, decorated military veteran Thomas Crow Feather, spent months documenting assessment irregularities that appear to be part of a coordinated effort to force rural landowners to sell property at below market prices to investors with connections to county assessment offices." Margaret felt a flush of pride at being described as someone who'd partnered with a decorated veteran to fight corruption. The article made their relationship sound professional and admirable, rather than the desperate alliance of two lonely people that she'd sometimes feared others might see. By the time they returned to the farm, the phone was already ringing with calls from other property owners who'd experienced similar assessment problems, reporters requesting interviews, and state officials wanting to discuss their evidence. Margaret realized that their quiet rural life was about to become significantly more complicated, but also potentially more meaningful if their fight could help other people facing similar challenges. "Are you ready for all of this attention?" Thomas asked as they listened to the phone ring insistently. Margaret looked at the man who'd transformed from a mysterious auction purchase into the love of her life and her strongest ally in the most important fight she'd ever faced. "With you beside me, I'm ready for anything." Thomas smiled and reached for the phone to begin what would be the first of many conversations with people who wanted to understand how two determined individuals had exposed a criminal conspiracy that had been operating with impunity for years. The battle was far from over, but Margaret and Thomas had proven that ordinary people could fight back against systematic corruption when they had the courage to stand together and refuse to be intimidated. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as partners who'd already demonstrated that love, determination, and careful preparation could overcome forces that seemed impossibly powerful and well-connected. The 50-cent investment that had brought them together was about to pay dividends that neither of them could have imagined when Margaret first raised her hand at that equipment auction. Justice, it seemed, sometimes came to those who were brave enough to demand it, especially when they didn't have to demand it alone. 6 months after the newspaper series exposed the property tax conspiracy, Margaret stood in her kitchen watching Thomas teach their neighbor's grandson how to repair fence posts with the same patient attention he'd once given to saving her farm. The criminal investigation had resulted in indictments for 12 county officials and the dismantling of the entire fraudulent assessment network that had terrorized rural families throughout the region. The state attorney general had personally delivered their property tax refund, along with formal apologies and assurances that such systematic corruption would never again be permitted to threaten honest citizens. Margaret's farm was not only secure but thriving under their continued partnership, with new contracts for sustainable farming practices that provided steady income and recognition as a model agricultural operation. Thomas had become something of a local celebrity, invited to speak at veterans organizations and community groups about the importance of refusing to surrender in the face of institutional intimidation. His military decorations had been restored to prominence, displayed in their living room alongside photographs of the farm's improvements and newspaper clippings documenting their successful fight against corruption. More importantly, Thomas had stopped wearing his mask except during particularly difficult emotional moments when old insecurities still surfaced. The community that had once viewed him with suspicion now saw him as a hero who'd helped protect their neighbors from criminal exploitation. Children no longer stared at his scars with fear, but with the kind of respectful curiosity reserved for someone who'd proven that courage could overcome any obstacle. The wedding ceremony took place in Margaret's front yard on a perfect spring morning, surrounded by friends and neighbors who'd come to celebrate a love story that had grown from desperate necessity into genuine partnership and mutual devotion. Jennifer Walsh served as maid of honor, having become a close friend through their shared commitment to exposing corruption and protecting vulnerable communities. Sheriff Morrison performed the ceremony, proud to officiate for the couple who'd demonstrated that ordinary citizens could achieve extraordinary results when they refused to accept injustice as inevitable. His words about partnership and perseverance carried special meaning for everyone who'd witnessed Margaret and Thomas transform their individual struggles into collective strength that benefited their entire community. As they exchanged rings that Thomas had crafted himself from reclaimed silver, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought them from a 50-cent auction transaction to a marriage built on mutual respect, shared values, and love that had been tested by challenges that would have destroyed weaker partnerships. The reception featured a cake decorated with tiny farm animals and legal scales, a whimsical tribute to their unusual courtship that had combined agricultural partnership with legal advocacy. Guests shared stories about how Margaret and Thomas's example had inspired them to stand up for their own rights and support their neighbors facing similar challenges. During their first dance as husband and wife, Thomas whispered his gratitude for the woman who'd seen past his scars to recognize his worth and potential. Margaret responded that she was grateful for the man who'd transformed her desperation into hope and her isolation into the kind of partnership she'd never imagined possible. The evening ended with Thomas revealing his wedding gift to Margaret, a deed that made her the sole owner of the farm they'd fought so hard to protect, along with a letter explaining that true partnership meant ensuring each person's security and independence rather than creating dependency or obligation. Margaret's gift to Thomas was equally meaningful, a framed photograph of his grandfather's ranch in Arizona, along with legal documents showing that she'd used their lawsuit settlement money to purchase the property back from the corporation that had bought it during his hospitalization. The ranch would be restored to the Crow-Feather family name, giving Thomas the chance to rebuild the legacy that had been lost while he served his country. As they settled into married life, Margaret and Thomas continued to receive letters from families throughout the region thanking them for the courage to fight systematic corruption that had threatened countless rural communities. Their victory had established legal precedents that protected property owners from fraudulent assessments and created oversight mechanisms that prevented similar schemes from developing. The farm prospered under their joint management, becoming a demonstration site for sustainable agriculture and veteran rehabilitation programs. Thomas's engineering skills and Margaret's administrative expertise created innovative solutions that attracted attention from agricultural researchers and policy experts, interested in replicating their success in other regions. On quiet evenings, they would sit on their front porch watching cattle graze in pastures that had been saved through their refusal to surrender to forces that had seemed overwhelming and unstoppable. The 50-cent investment that had brought them together had yielded returns that couldn't be measured in financial terms, creating a partnership that had transformed two broken lives into something stronger and more meaningful than either could have achieved alone. Margaret often reflected that the best decisions in life were sometimes the most desperate ones, made by people who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from taking chances on possibilities that seemed impossible to others. Thomas had taught her that true value couldn't be assessed by appearances or circumstances, and that the most important partnerships were built on mutual respect rather than mutual need. Their love story became a legend in Miller County, proof that authentic connection could flourish in the most unlikely circumstances, when two people were willing to see past surface appearances to recognize the character and potential that lay beneath. The masked man from the auction had revealed himself to be exactly what Margaret needed, and the desperate widow had proven to be everything Thomas had hoped to find. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.